She thinks being happy is being someplace else. If there was one line that is going to crystallize what Frank Higgins' play The Sweet By and By is about, I think that's the one. So this play is set in Glendaniel, West Virginia, which, as far as I know, is not a real town. But it's based on any number of real towns. There's a ton of small towns, rural communities, mining towns in West Virginia that are very much like Glendaniel in this play. And the conflict, the central conflict, kind of revolves around this question of, do you leave? Can you leave? Should you leave? Right? And this is actually a really big thing in contemporary West Virginia culture. So the play tells the story of Babe Bradley, her daughter Libby, and her mother Granny or Grandma. Babe is a miner's widow, and more than anything else, she wants Libby to leave Glendaniel, to leave West Virginia. She wants Libby to go to college. She wants her to go experience the world, to learn more about the world outside of this small town with its limited opportunities. There's like large chunks of this where Babe just presents her negative, though not necessarily entirely inaccurate, perspective on what being in small town mining community West Virginia means. High likelihood of domestic abuse, poverty, not having sort of knowledge of culture, of the arts, of things like this. Having a number of children, whether or not you want to, the danger of the mines. She at one point has this bit where she says here, so Libby initially wants to marry Owen. Let me just figure out here what Owen's last name is, because I don't remember. Not that it makes that much of a difference. Owen Flynn. So Libby initially wants to marry Owen Flynn, who's a miner. Babe is dead set against this. And Owen points out, you married a coal miner. Babe says, yeah, and he got his dumb butt killed in a cave-in. Libby says that won't happen to him. And this is where I think it gets interesting. Babe says he's got no say what happens to him. Even when every miner in town is covered in coal dust, I can recognize who's who from what's wrong with them. Would a Combs with only 2 fingers and a thumb on his left hand go for Davenport from how he limps on his right knee? And then there's, and she knocks on Owen's chest several times, young Owen Flynn, easiest of all to spot, with nothing wrong with him, still waiting for his first accident. And, interestingly enough, later in the play, Owen does come back missing a finger. So this idea that the mines invariably do physical damage to people. But even in this opening portion, when Owen appears physically healthy, he has the telltale cough that suggests he's working his way toward black lung disease. And so this idea is really, really central to the play, this idea that the mines are not just inherently dangerous, but inescapably dangerous. The mines will always destroy the people who go into them, and by extension, the families that they support or that they leave behind in the case of their deaths. And so this is why Babe is so set on Libby leaving Glendaniel, leaving West Virginia, going to college and having these kinds of opportunities that Babe herself never got, but always wanted to be able to escape this life in this coal mining town. The contrast to this, and actually, so Babe has invested a lot of their money. Like, she's sold off family heirlooms to buy an encyclopedia for Libby to study from, and she pushes Libby to study harder in school, only to somewhat later find out that in these small rural West Virginia towns, even the best education is underfunded and dumbed down. They have a modern translation of Shakespeare rather than reading Shakespeare in the original early modern English. They're reading in a kind of West Virginia Appalachian colloquial version of this. And so Babe had this sort of notion that, if Libby studies Shakespeare and she learns these things that educated people are learning, she will be able to get out of Glendaniel. She'll be able to pursue a future. And she kind of finds out that that's not necessarily going to be the case. But this is one of the this is one of the sides of the sort of agonistic conflict of this play, right? The idea of an agonistic conflict is you have two ethical positions competing with one another, neither of which is necessarily right or wrong, but both of which have some kind of merit. Babe presents one of those agonistic positions in that she advocates Libby escaping the limitations of Glendaniel and going out and sort of finding opportunities to be more cultured, to be more to make more money, to do all these things. The other perspective is kind of represented by Grandma. This is again, Babe's mother. She is a very proud Bradley, and that in this context means that she's been in this house for a long time. Her family, her ancestors have been in Glendaniel since before the American Revolution began. Her husband had been one of the principal organizers of the union, the miners' union, when it came to Glendaniel, and he had been actually shot in their living room by gun thugs, by the hired goons of the mining company, who opposed unionization. And this was a very common thing in the early days of unionization in places like West Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, these Appalachian mining communities. There's very, very often violence directed against union organizers. And so Mama Bradley's husband had been shot while trying to organize a union. And so she represents this pull of tradition that's very, very strong and very, very cohesive in a place like rural West Virginia, in Appalachia. This idea that you stay where you're from, you stay loyal to your kin, you stay loyal to your ancestors. These kinds of things that are really, really important to West Virginia culture. And so she represents that competing pull, and Libby is kind of caught in the middle, because on the one hand, she's not especially interested in going out and she doesn't look at the world the way that her mother looks at the world. Libby doesn't look at the world the way that Babe looks at the world. So she's not especially interested in education. She doesn't necessarily see education as a sort of means to an end of getting out of Glendaniel. But when the sort of flashy circus performer Newton Horton sort of returns to town, Libby is dazzled by him, and after there's some sort of conflict between the Bradleys and Owen Flynn, Libby does go off with Newton, and she goes and sort of experiences Washington, D.C., and goes to the Smithsonian and goes to see the Capitol building and things like this. She goes to Philadelphia. She goes to these different places and sort of gets some of this experience of the world. But then in the second act, toward the middle portion of the second act, she actually returns home. And initially, she lies about why she's left Newton. She claims that he has continued womanizing, which he apparently had done before Libby had gone on the road with him. So Libby uses that as sort of an excuse. But then when Newt shows up, as he goes by Newt, when Newt shows up and he's like, no, I haven't done any of that. Like, she just left me. Libby tells the truth about why she has returned, which is that she doesn't feel at home outside of Glendaniel. Like, Glendaniel is for her a central part of her identity, and Babe is just not prepared to accept this. And so she kind of snaps, and she threatens to take Grandma to a nursing home, which Grandma abhors. She absolutely refuses this idea. Babe threatens to sell this quilt that is really important to Grandma, that Grandma wants to be buried in. But Babe knows that she can get a lot of money for it, so she threatens to sell it. And basically, Libby and Babe have an actual physical fight in which Libby ends up overpowering Babe and basically forces her to give this idea up, to let them stay in Glendaniel. And the play kind of wraps up with this odd compromise space in which Grandma... So we get a sort of weird temporal shift at the end, because we have the events of the play, but then we have a bit where Babe sort of steps out and soliloquizes to the audience, basically, from a time later in the future after Grandma has died and been buried in the quilt she wanted to be buried in. But then Babe gets called back into the scene in that moment where Grandma is still alive. So there's a weird temporal bit there. But Babe sort of comes around to remaining in Glendaniel, even though this is the thing she has been opposed to all of her life. And Libby gets, in a way, the best of both worlds, because she's had that experience of going out and seeing other things, experiencing other things in the world, but then she can come home to Glendaniel and sort of have this setup where she gets to have followed the path that Babe wanted her to follow, and she gets to follow the path that Grandma wanted her to follow. So she forges this sort of middle road for herself. where she knows what she wants, and it's not a case of I've missed my opportunity to go out and experience the world. It's I had gone out and experienced the world, and I choose to be here.